Maria sat at her kitchen table at 7:47 p.m. on a Friday evening, watching the clock on the wall tick away each agonizing second. Her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee, the ceramic mug warm against her palms, though her hands trembled slightly. Outside, the Denver evening had turned cold, the spring air crisp with that particular tension that comes before a storm. She was waiting, as she had waited every other Friday for the past 8 months, for her daughter Sarah to be dropped off by her ex-husband, Robert. The marriage had ended 2 years ago, and it had been anything but amicable. Robert, a successful mortgage broker with connections and money to burn, had fought ferociously for custody. He'd hired the most expensive family law attorneys in Colorado, men in sharp suits who looked at Maria, a high school teacher living modestly in a small house in Denver, with barely concealed contempt. The divorce proceedings had been brutal, filled with accusations, counter-accusations, and courtroom battles that seemed to drag on interminably. In the end, they'd settled on joint custody. Sarah would spend weekdays with Maria during the school year and extended weekends with Robert, alternating between his modern high-rise apartment downtown and his vacation home in the mountains. On paper, it seemed reasonable. In reality, it was destroying Maria's daughter. The first few months after the initial custody arrangement had seemed fine. Sarah had adapted to the new normal with the resilience children somehow possessed. She'd adjusted to packing her backpack with clothes and toiletries, to saying goodbye to her mother every other Friday afternoon, to being driven across the city in her father's expensive sedan. Maria had told herself it was healthy for Sarah to maintain a strong relationship with both parents. She'd repeated the mantras that every parenting book and therapist suggested. Children benefit from involved fathers. Stability comes from routine. Anger and bitterness only hurt the children. But then, very gradually, Maria began to notice things. Small things at first. Sarah returning from a weekend visit and immediately retreating to her room, claiming she was tired. Sarah, who had always been chatty and animated, becoming quieter, more introspective. Sarah developing an inexplicable fear of thunderstorms, lying in Maria's bed at night with her heart racing, her small body rigid with anxiety. Then came the physical signs. Sarah waking up with nightmares she refused to discuss, her fingernails bitten down to the quick, dark circles appearing under her bright blue eyes despite getting plenty of sleep. Maria had approached it carefully at first, asking gentle questions during their evening routines. "How was Dad's this weekend, sweetie?" Sarah would shrug, offering minimal responses. "Did you have fun?" Another shrug. "Daddy took you to the movies, right?" A nod, but no enthusiasm, no details. It was as if someone had turned down the volume on her daughter's personality, dimming her light to the barest flicker. Then came the incident that truly frightened Maria. One Tuesday evening, Sarah had been sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework when Maria had suddenly stood up to grab something from the refrigerator. The movement was innocent, casual. She'd simply risen from her chair quickly. But Sarah had flinched so violently that she'd fallen backward, her chair clattering to the floor, her homework scattering across the kitchen tiles. Her small face had gone pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. When Maria rushed to help her up, Sarah had been trembling, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine terror, as if her own mother had raised a hand to strike her. "Sarah, honey, what's wrong?" Maria had asked, her voice gentle but her heart hammering with alarm. "Nothing," Sarah had whispered, scrambling to pick up her homework with shaking hands. I didn't see you move." That night, Maria had sat on the edge of Sarah's bed long after her daughter had fallen asleep, watching her child's chest rise and fall, nodding the tension that never quite left her small frame even in sleep. Something was profoundly wrong. Maria was certain of it with every maternal instinct she possessed, the kind of knowing that goes beyond logic or evidence, the kind that mothers develop through years of reading their children's moods and bodies and hearts. Over the following weeks, Maria began documenting things. She kept a small notebook hidden in her desk drawer, recording the dates of Sarah's visits to Robert's place and what she observed upon Sarah's return. The behavioral changes, the anxiety spikes, the way Sarah would sometimes flinch at sudden sounds or movements, the occasions when Sarah had cried, really cried deep, inconsolable sobs without being able to articulate why. Maria also noted Sarah's reluctance to discuss her visits, the way her daughter would change the subject whenever Robert was mentioned, the unusual emotional withdrawal that seemed to deepen with each passing week. Maria consulted with Sarah's teacher, Ms., during a conference in early March. She approached the topic delicately, not wanting to seem like a vindictive ex-wife manufacturing stories. Ms.'s expression had grown increasingly concerned as Maria described Sarah's recent behavior changes. "She's been quieter in class," Ms. had confirmed, "and she's been withdrawn during group activities. Last week during a presentation, she started shaking and asked to sit down. I've never seen her like this before." Armed with these observations, Maria knew she had to take action, but she also knew the truth. She had no concrete evidence, no bruises, no documented abuse, just observations and a mother's terrified intuition. In family court, intuition wasn't enough. She needed proof, or at least a compelling case. That's when Maria made the difficult decision to contact a family law attorney. She chose carefully, selecting Sarah Mitchell, a lawyer known for handling sensitive custody cases involving emotional abuse and child welfare concerns. During their first consultation, Maria had sat across from Sarah Mitchell's desk and felt tears streaming down her face as she tried to articulate what she was witnessing. "I know it sounds vague," Maria had said, her voice breaking, "but something is happening. My daughter is terrified and I don't know what to do." Sarah Mitchell had listened carefully, taking notes, asking probing questions. Finally, she'd leaned back in her chair and looked directly at Maria. "We can file for a modification of the custody arrangement," she'd said, "but it will be difficult without concrete evidence. Your ex-husband's attorneys will argue that you're a bitter ex-wife trying to use the court system as a weapon. We'll need to build a strong case." She'd paused. "Are you prepared for this? A custody battle can be emotionally exhausting, and your daughter will likely be involved in the legal process." Maria had nodded without hesitation. She would do whatever it took to protect her child. Now, sitting at her kitchen table on this Friday evening, Maria waited for Sarah to come home. She listened for the sound of Robert's car in the driveway, preparing herself for whatever state her daughter would be in when she walked through that door. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she held the mug anyway, drawing what little comfort she could from its weight. She didn't know yet that a golden retriever named Max would soon change everything. She didn't know that the secret signal her daughter would create with a dog would become the key to finally unlocking the truth. All Maria knew in this moment was that her daughter needed her, more than she'd ever needed anything in her life. And she was going to fight like hell to save her. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April when Maria's mother arrived unexpectedly at their small Denver home. Was a woman of 73 years, still sharp as a tack, with silver hair she wore in an elegant braid and eyes that missed nothing. She knocked on the front door just as Sarah was getting home from school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her expression as flat and emotionless as it had been for the past several weeks. Maria opened the door to find her mother standing there with a knowing smile, the kind of smile that suggested had been planning something. But what Maria didn't expect was what it brought with her. Behind stood a man in his mid-40s, professional and kind-looking, holding the leash of the most beautiful golden retriever Maria had ever seen. The dog was large but graceful, his coat a deep burnished gold that seemed to catch the afternoon sunlight. His eyes were intelligent and warm, and he moved with a calm, measured confidence that immediately put Maria at ease. "Mom," Maria asked, completely bewildered, "what's going on?" Stepped inside, gesturing for the man and the dog to follow. Maria, I want you to meet Dr. James, an animal behaviorist specializing in emotional support animals. And this, she said, placing a gentle hand on the dog's head, is Max. Sarah, who had been about to head upstairs to her room, her typical response to coming home from school, suddenly froze. She stared at the dog with an intensity that Maria hadn't seen from her daughter in months. For the first time in a long time, something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Interest, wonder, hope. "I don't understand," Maria said, looking at her mother. "Mom, what is this?" Smiled and guided everyone into the living room. "Sit down, both of you. I have a story to tell you." What unfolded over the next hour was a revelation that Maria had never anticipated. Explained that she had been deeply troubled by the changes she'd observed in Sarah during their visits. As Sarah's grandmother, had watched her granddaughter transform from a bright, talkative child into someone withdrawn and anxious. Unable to sit passively by, had begun researching solutions. She discovered the remarkable work being done with emotional support animals, particularly in helping children who had experienced trauma or were currently experiencing emotional distress. Doctor then explained Max's background. Max was not simply a pet. He was a professionally trained emotional support animal who had completed over 2 years of specialized training. His credentials were extensive and he had been trained to recognize the physiological signs of anxiety and panic in children. The rapid breathing, the tense posture, the dilated pupils, the trembling hands. When Max detected these signs, he had been trained to respond in specific ways, pressing against the child, resting his head on their lap, providing grounding weight and comfort that could literally calm the nervous system. Emotional support animals work through a combination of intuition and training, Doctor explained, his voice calm and professional. Max has learned to recognize distress signals, but he also has an innate empathy that makes him particularly suited for this work. He has a gentle temperament, endless patience, and an ability to connect with children on an emotional level that's quite remarkable. He went on to explain Max's training in detail. Max had learned to respond to specific hand signals and commands. He could recognize when a child was becoming anxious and could provide appropriate comfort. He had been socialized extensively to remain calm in public settings, courtrooms, hospitals, and other potentially stressful environments. His training had included desensitization to loud noises, sudden movements, and other triggers that might startle a typical dog, but that Max needed to handle with equanimity. "But here's the most important thing," Doctor continued, looking directly at Sarah, who hadn't taken her eyes off Max for a single moment. "Max's job is to be your companion, to listen without judgment, to be present with you exactly as you are, without asking for anything except your companionship. Max is trained, but he's also just a dog who genuinely cares about the person he's with." Sarah's small voice emerged, barely above a whisper. Can I pet him?" Doctor smiled warmly. "That's exactly what Max wants you to do." What happened next was almost magical. Sarah slowly approached Max, her small hand reaching out tentatively. When her fingers made contact with Max's soft golden fur, something shifted in her entire body. The tension that had become her constant companion seemed to ease just slightly. Max turned his head and pressed it gently against Sarah's chest, acknowledging her touch with a soft sound that was almost a purr, though it came from a dog. Over the following hour, Doctor worked with both Maria and Sarah, teaching them basic commands and responses. He showed Sarah how to signal Max when she needed comfort, developing a series of hand gestures that would become their private language. He taught Sarah a specific hand movement, a gentle sweeping gesture followed by a small tap on her chest that would signal to Max that she was feeling scared or unsafe. Whenever Sarah made this gesture, Max would immediately respond, pressing against her leg or resting his head on her lap. "This is your signal," Doctor explained to Sarah. "This is your special way of telling Max, I need you right now. And Max will always come to you when you make this signal. That's his promise to you." Sarah practiced the gesture over and over, and each time, Max responded with perfect consistency. A small smile appeared on Sarah's face, the first genuine smile Maria had seen in weeks. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah remained close to Max, her hand constantly touching his fur, drawing comfort from his steadfast presence. When Doctor finally prepared to leave, he handed the leash to Sarah. "Max is yours now," he said. "He's your partner, your support, and your friend. Take good care of each other." That evening, for the first time in months, Sarah ate dinner without her mother having to coax her. She actually talked about school, about her day, about things she'd been holding inside. Max lay beside her chair, occasionally glancing up at her with those intelligent, loving eyes. When bedtime came, Sarah asked if Max could sleep in her room. Maria hesitated only for a moment before agreeing. She watched as her daughter curled up beside the golden retriever, her small arm draped over his side, her breathing finally slowing into something that resembled peace. Max didn't move all night. He simply lay there, present and steady, a four-legged guardian against the darkness. As Maria watched them sleep, she felt something shift within her, a fierce determination mixed with gratitude. Had given her daughter something invaluable, a bridge back to safety, a living embodiment of unconditional support, and most importantly, hope. Max had arrived in their lives at exactly the right moment. And though Maria didn't know it yet, Max would soon become the most powerful witness in a courtroom battle that would change everything. The morning of March 15th dawned gray and cold in Denver. Maria woke before her alarm, her stomach churning with anxiety, her mind already racing through the worst possible scenarios. Today was the day. After months of preparation, legal filings, and mounting tension, the custody modification hearing was finally happening. In just 3 hours, she would walk into a Colorado courtroom and attempt to convince a judge that her ex-husband was emotionally abusing their daughter. Maria had barely slept. She'd lain awake beside Sarah all night, listening to her daughter's breathing, trying to absorb as much courage as she could from the fact that at least Max was here, lying protectively on the other side of Sarah's small frame. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, Maria got up and began preparing. She chose her clothing carefully, nothing flashy or attention-seeking, just a simple navy blazer over a white blouse and dark slacks. Professional but approachable, trustworthy. Her lawyer, Sarah Mitchell, had coached her extensively on courtroom presentation. "The judge will be watching everything," Sarah had said. "Your body language, your demeanor, whether you seem credible or bitter. We're not just presenting facts, we're presenting a narrative about who you are as a mother." Sarah, meanwhile, had woken up anxious. She clung to Max like a lifeline, her small hands buried in his golden fur. Maria had spent the past week preparing her daughter for what to expect, using language the child psychologist had recommended. "There will be people in a big room," Maria had explained gently. "And they're going to ask you questions about your visits with Dad. It might feel scary, but it's okay to tell the truth, and Max will be nearby." But as the morning progressed, Sarah's anxiety only deepened. By 9 a.m., the child was trembling, her breakfast untouched on the table. Max seemed to sense her distress, remaining constantly by her side, his head pressed against her leg in a gesture of unwavering support. The Denver District Courthouse was an imposing structure of granite and glass, built in the 1970s with that particular architectural style that managed to be both modern and somehow coldly forbidding. Maria held Sarah's hand as they climbed the wide stone steps, with Max walking between them on his leash. Other people hurried past, lawyers with briefcases, other families caught in their own custody disputes, court officers with stern expressions. Inside, the courthouse was all echoing hallways and formal signage. They met with Sarah Mitchell in a private consultation room just outside the courtroom. Sarah Mitchell was a woman in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and competent, with a reputation for taking cases involving child welfare seriously. She had spent the past 5 months building their case, documenting Sarah's behavioral changes, collecting statements from Sarah's teacher and therapist, and preparing to argue that emotional abuse constituted a change in circumstances significant enough to warrant modification of the custody arrangement. "Remember," Sarah Mitchell said, looking at both Maria and Sarah, "we're here because we believe Sarah's best interests are served by this custody modification. The court will hear our evidence, and then the other side will present theirs. It's going to be intense, but we're prepared." The courtroom itself was everything Sarah had feared and more. It was large and imposing, with high ceilings and wood paneling that made everything feel official and weighty. The judge sat elevated at his bench, looking down at everyone else. To one side sat opposing counsel, Robert's attorneys, two men in expensive suits with cold, calculating expressions. And there was Robert himself, dressed immaculately in a tailored suit, his expression one of wounded confusion, as if he couldn't fathom why his ex-wife was trying to destroy him this way. It was a performance, Maria thought bitterly. Everything about Robert was performance. Maria first, describing the behavioral changes she'd observed in Sarah since the custody arrangement began. She spoke about the nightmares, the anxiety, the withdrawal. She described the incident where Sarah had flinched violently at a simple movement. She tried to paint a picture of a child in distress, a child who needed protection. But Robert's attorneys tore into her testimony with methodical precision. They suggested she was a scorned ex-wife, bitter about the divorce, using false accusations to manipulate custody arrangements. They implied that Maria was coaching Sarah, putting ideas into her head, turning the child against her father. They questioned whether any of the behavioral changes could be attributed to normal childhood anxiety or the stress of divorce itself. The judge's expression remained impassive, but Maria could sense skepticism. She could see it in the way he made notes, the way he didn't quite meet her eyes. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt defeated. Then it was Sarah's turn. The child psychologist who had been working with Sarah accompanied her to the witness stand. Sarah looked impossibly small, her feet swinging above the floor of the stand, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. Maria could see her daughter gathering her courage, could see Max watching intently from his designated spot in the courtroom. At first, Sarah tried. She answered basic questions about her visits to her father's house. What did you do? What rooms did you go to? Who else was there? But then Robert's primary attorney stood up for cross-examination. His name was Richard Dalton, and he was known for being particularly aggressive with child witnesses. His strategy was clear. Confuse Sarah, make her contradict herself, make her testimony seem unreliable. "Isn't it true," Dalton began, his voice sharp and cutting, "that you've recently spent a lot of time with your mother's new dog? A dog that your grandmother conveniently provided right before this hearing?" Sarah flinched at the aggression in his tone. Yes," she stammered. "And didn't your mother tell you that if you said certain things in court, the dog would be here to comfort you?" "No, that's not," Sarah began, but Dalton cut her off. "Don't you think it's possible that you're confused about what actually happened and what your mother has suggested happened? Children can be very suggestible, you know." Sarah's breathing became rapid, her face flushed. Her small hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. "Can you describe specifically what your father did that was inappropriate?" Dalton demanded. "Give me dates, times, exact words, because right now all I'm hearing is vague accusations and a daughter being manipulated by a vindictive mother." Sarah opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Tears began streaming down her face. The more Dalton pressed, the more she fell apart. He asked leading questions designed to confuse her, to make her doubt her own memories. He suggested that she was exaggerating, that children often misinterpret their parents' actions, that divorce had made her emotional and vulnerable to suggestion. The courtroom fell silent except for Sarah's quiet sobs. Maria felt her heart breaking as she watched her daughter completely shut down, unable to articulate the fear and pain she carried. Sarah was freezing up, exactly as Dalton intended. The judge watched this with an expression that was difficult to read, perhaps skeptical, perhaps sympathetic, but certainly not convinced. When Dalton finally finished his cross-examination, Sarah was completely destroyed, her testimony in ruins, her voice lost. As Sarah was excused from the stand, the judge turned to the attorneys. "We'll break here for lunch and reconvene this afternoon for closing arguments." But as Sarah climbed down from the witness stand, she looked toward Max with desperate eyes. The dog stood up, straining against his leash, sensing her overwhelming distress. And in that moment, something shifted. Something was about to change in ways no one in that courtroom could have anticipated. The lunch break was a disaster. Sarah refused to eat, sitting silently in the consultation room with her eyes fixed on the wall, occasionally reaching down to touch Max's fur as if checking that he was still real, still present. Max remained calm and steady, but even the well-trained dog seemed to sense the magnitude of what was happening. Maria felt her hope slipping away like sand through her fingers. Sarah Mitchell paced the small room, her jaw clenched. "Dalton was brutal," she said, her voice tight with frustration. And it worked. The judge saw a child who couldn't articulate anything coherent, who contradicted herself, whose testimony seemed unreliable. "He's going to rule against us. I can feel it." "There has to be something we can do," Maria said desperately. She was doing so well at home. It's just that he scared her, confused her. Sarah Mitchell stopped packing. She looked at Sarah, then at Max. An idea seemed to crystallize behind her eyes. "Maybe there is something, it's unconventional, it might not work, but I'm going to try." When they reconvened in the courtroom after lunch, the tension was palpable. Closing arguments were about to begin, and everyone present could sense which way this case was leaning. The judge seemed ready to dismiss Maria's claims as the desperate accusations of a bitter ex-wife. Robert sat with an expression of vindicated satisfaction, his attorneys looking confident and relaxed. Then Sarah Mitchell stood up. "Your Honor, before we proceed with closing arguments, I have a motion to present to the court." The judge looked up from his papers, his expression neutral. "Go ahead, Ms. Mitchell." "Your Honor," Sarah Mitchell began, her voice steady and professional, "we have a certified emotional support animal present in the courtroom. This animal has been professionally trained to recognize and respond to signs of anxiety and emotional distress in children. I am respectfully requesting that this animal be permitted to remain in close proximity to the witness during her testimony, should the court allow for a follow-up questioning session." The courtroom erupted. Richard Dalton was on his feet immediately, his face reddening with anger. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. This is nothing more than an attempt to manipulate the testimony through emotional appeals and gimmickry. A dog in the courtroom. This violates every principle of reliable testimony." "Your Honor," his co-counsel added, "allowing an animal in the courtroom would be highly irregular and could prejudice the jury. Well, would prejudice the judge in this case. It would suggest that we should feel sympathy for the witness rather than evaluate her testimony objectively." The judge raised his hand, silencing both attorneys. He looked at Sarah Mitchell with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Ms. Mitchell, I understand you're trying to help your client, but counsel is correct that this is highly unusual. What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her confidence evident. "Your Honor, I'm not proposing that the dog serve as evidence. I'm proposing that the dog serve as a tool to help a traumatized child access her own testimony. The dog is not here to influence the truth. It's here to help the witness tell the truth. Max is a certified emotional support animal with extensive training. His presence has been documented to help children who have experienced trauma become calmer and more able to articulate their experiences." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Your Honor, what we witnessed this morning was not a child giving unreliable testimony. What we witnessed was a child becoming so frightened and overwhelmed that she was unable to speak coherently despite having clear memories and real experiences. There is a significant difference between a child who is lying and a child who is too traumatized to communicate. A trained emotional support animal can bridge that gap. "This is nonsense," Dalton interjected. "Your Honor, if we allow every traumatized witness to have a comfort animal, we undermine the entire judicial process. Where does it end?" The judge held up his hand again. He studied Sarah Mitchell for a long moment, then looked toward where Sarah sat in the gallery, her small frame hunched in on itself, her hand gripping Max's collar as if it were a lifeline. "What is your response to the concern that this might improperly influence the testimony?" the judge asked Sarah Mitchell. "Your Honor, I would argue that removing emotional support from a traumatized child also influences testimony, but in the wrong direction. It silences truth rather than facilitating it. The animal is not here to suggest answers or to manipulate responses. Max simply provides calming presence. The truth remains the truth, whether the child is holding a dog or not." Robert's attorneys continued their objections, but Sarah Mitchell held her ground, presenting case law and research on emotional support animals in legal proceedings. She referenced studies showing that children with anxiety disorders were able to recall events more accurately when they had animal support. She cited examples from other states where courts had allowed similar accommodations. The judge listened, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to something more contemplative. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He looked directly at Sarah. "Young lady," the judge said gently, "come here for a moment." Sarah froze. Maria's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Slowly, Sarah stood up and approached the judge's bench. Max stood as well, and the judge didn't object to the dog following. "What's your name?" the judge asked. "Sarah," the girl whispered. "Sarah, do you have something to tell us about your visits to your father's house?" Sarah's eyes welled with tears. She glanced back at Max, then at her mother. I want to tell the truth," she said, her voice barely audible, "but I'm scared." The judge studied her face for a long moment. Then he looked at Max, at the way the dog stood protectively beside the child, at the way Sarah's hand instinctively reached down to touch his fur. "You know what?" the judge said finally. "I've been practicing law for over 30 years, and I've learned that the courtroom can be a very frightening place for children. If having this dog nearby helps you tell the truth, then I think that's what we should do." He paused, fixing Dalton with a stern look. "The court is granting the motion. The animal will remain in close proximity to the witness. This is not about sympathy or gimmickry. This is about facilitating justice." Dalton's face turned purple with rage. "Your Honor, I must lodge a formal objection to this highly irregular." "Objection noted and overruled," the judge interrupted sharply. "Ms. Mitchell, prepare your witness for follow-up questioning. We'll proceed in 15 minutes. As Sarah was led back to her seat, she and Max moved together as a single unit. For the first time since the hearing began, Maria saw a glimmer of something in her daughter's eyes. Not confidence exactly, but something close to it. A recognition that she wasn't alone. A knowledge that something believed in her. Max settled beside Sarah's seat, and the dog's mere presence seemed to shift the energy in the entire courtroom. Even the judge, returning to his bench, seemed somehow more focused, more determined to seek the truth. Sarah Mitchell caught Maria's eye and gave a subtle nod. The next phase of this battle was about to begin. And this time, Sarah wouldn't be facing it alone. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. Sarah sat in the consultation room with her mother and Max, her small body wound tight as a spring. Maria held her daughter close, breathing slowly and deliberately, trying to calm her own racing heart so that Sarah might absorb some of that calm through osmosis. Max rested his head on Sarah's lap, his warm brown eyes fixed on the child's face, with an intensity that suggested he understood the gravity of what was about to happen. "Remember what we practiced," Maria whispered softly. "You just have to tell the truth, that's all. You don't have to remember everything. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest about what happened." Sarah nodded slowly, her fingers buried deep in Max's golden fur. "What if I forget what I want to say?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "Then you tell them you forgot," Maria said. "Or you ask them to ask the question again. Or you say you don't know. All of those things are okay. The only thing that matters is that you tell the truth as you remember it." Sarah Mitchell appeared in the doorway. "It's time," she said gently. As they walked back into the courtroom, Sarah's hand found Max's collar. The dog moved with perfect composure, his training evident in every step. He seemed to understand that this moment was crucial, that his behavior could impact the outcome. When they reached Sarah's seat in the witness box, Max lay down directly beside her, close enough that she could reach down and touch him at any moment. Sarah was sworn in again. The courtroom felt different this time, the air charged with a different kind of energy. Even Richard Dalton seemed to sense that something had shifted. His expression was wary, watchful. Sarah Mitchell began gently. "Sarah, I know this is scary, but I want you to tell us in your own words about what happens during your visits to your father's house. Just start wherever you feel comfortable starting." Sarah took a deep breath. Her hand found Max's fur, and then very quietly she began to speak. "When I go to Dad's house on Friday, he's usually angry about something," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He gets angry about my grades, even though I get good grades. He gets angry about what I wore to school. He gets angry about things that don't even make sense." As Sarah spoke, her words came slowly at first, hesitant and fragmented, but there was a steadiness to them now that hadn't been there in the morning. She described incidents, her father yelling at her for not finishing her vegetables fast enough, for sitting wrong at the dinner table, for laughing too loud at the television. She described how he would lecture her for hours about her failures and shortcomings, his voice harsh and cutting. "He tells me I'm stupid," Sarah said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "He tells me that I'm a disappointment. He tells me that Mom filled my head with lies about him and that I'm being disloyal by not defending him to her. He says I'm ungrateful." Richard Dalton began his cross-examination with the same aggressive energy he'd employed in the morning. "So these incidents you're describing, your father expressing displeasure about your behavior, that's abuse. Every parent corrects their children." "He doesn't correct me," Sarah said, her voice getting slightly stronger. He yells, he tells me I'm worthless, and then," she paused, swallowing hard. "And then he cries and tells me he's sorry and that he loves me and that it's my fault for making him so angry, and then I have to comfort him." "That's not abuse," Dalton said harshly. "That's a parent having a difficult time and a child showing compassion." Sarah shook her head. "No, it's confusing because I love him, but I'm also scared of him, and I don't know why he makes me feel like it's my fault." As Dalton continued his aggressive questioning, Sarah's anxiety began to spike. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands trembled. She was starting to fall apart again, starting to lose her words beneath the weight of his intimidation. And then, without conscious thought, Sarah made the signal. It was the gesture she and Max had practiced countless times in the safety of her home, a subtle hand movement, a sweeping arc across her body followed by a small tap against her chest. It was the signal that meant, "I'm scared. I need you." What happened next was extraordinary. Max's entire body responded with an intensity that seemed to transcend mere training. The dog lifted his head, his ears perking forward. His body shifted closer to Sarah, but not in a way that seemed aggressive or disobedient. It was as if Max understood, at a cellular level, that his girl needed him in this exact moment. Max pressed his entire side against Sarah's leg. Then, with a gentleness that seemed almost miraculous, the dog rested his head directly on Sarah's lap, his full weight pressing against her thigh. It was a gesture of complete, unconditional support, a physical manifestation of presence and protection. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Every eye in the room was fixed on the child and the dog. Journalists leaned forward in their seats, their pens poised over notebooks. Several jurors, the judge, since this wasn't a jury trial, seemed to pause in whatever they were about to do. Court officers straightened in their seats. Dalton himself seemed momentarily thrown off balance. He'd been mid-sentence when Max responded to Sarah's signal, and the interruption had broken his rhythm. But the most profound change was in Sarah. With Max's weight anchoring her, his presence declaring to the entire courtroom that she was worthy of protection, something unlocked inside the child. Her breathing steadied. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, began to relax. Her hands, which had been trembling, stilled. "I'm ready," Sarah said quietly, looking at Dalton. "You can ask me again." Dalton exchanged a glance with his co-counsel, confusion and something that might have been frustration crossing his face. He continued his questioning, but his edge seemed blunted somehow. And Sarah, this version of Sarah, was different. She remained calm. She answered questions directly and honestly. When she didn't know something, she said so. When she disagreed with his characterization of events, she said that too. Most importantly, she no longer seemed like a frightened child who could be bullied into confusion. She seemed like a child telling the truth. The judge watched all of this with an expression that had transformed from skeptical to deeply engaged. He leaned forward slightly, observing not just Sarah's words, but the interaction between child and dog. The way Max never moved from his position against her leg. The way Sarah's hand remained in constant contact with his fur. The way the animal's mere presence seemed to give the child access to her own courage. When Dalton finally finished his cross-examination, he sat down looking genuinely unsettled. The courtroom air felt different, charged with a new energy, a shift toward truth that even the most skeptical observer couldn't deny. The judge turned to Sarah, his expression grave but not unkind. "Thank you for your courage today, Sarah. You may step down." As Sarah left the witness stand, Max rose and walked beside her, never breaking his connection to the child. And somewhere in that moment, in the space between the child and the dog, justice began to find its footing. The moment seemed to suspend itself in time, hanging in the courtroom air like a crystal-catching light. What everyone had just witnessed was not a simple interaction between a child and a dog. It was something far more profound, a non-verbal testimony more powerful than any spoken words could be. The journalists in the back of the courtroom were scribbling frantically, their pens moving across notepads with frantic energy. One woman, a reporter from the Denver Post, had her phone camera trained on Sarah and Max, capturing the exact moment of the signal and Max's response. Another journalist leaned over to her colleague and whispered something that made his eyes widen. They all seemed to understand that they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended the ordinary mechanics of a custody hearing. Several of the jurors, the judge in this case, but if there had been a jury they would have been similarly affected, seemed visibly moved. One court officer, a woman in her 60s with graying hair and a stern expression, had tears in her eyes. Another was leaning back in his chair, his hand over his mouth, his expression one of dawning realization. Richard Dalton sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his temples seemed to pulse with tension. His co-counsel kept glancing at him nervously, as if waiting for instructions. The confident, aggressive demeanor that had characterized Dalton's entire cross-examination had been replaced by something that looked very much like shock. The judge himself had gone very still. His pen had stopped moving. His eyes, which had been somewhat distant and analytical throughout much of the morning's testimony, were now fixed intently on Sarah and Max. There was something in his expression that suggested he was witnessing something that had shifted his understanding of the case fundamentally. Maria sat in the gallery behind the bar, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had seen this signal work with her daughter dozens of times at home, had witnessed its calming effect, but seeing it function in this formal, high-stakes environment was something entirely different. It was the difference between witnessing a private miracle and having that miracle validated in public, transformed into something undeniable. Sarah Mitchell sat forward in her seat, her professional composure visibly affected by what had just transpired. She knew, in that moment, that something fundamental had changed in this case. She had gambled by requesting that Max be allowed in the courtroom, had risked seeming unprofessional or manipulative, but that gamble had paid off in a way that far exceeded her expectations. As Sarah returned to her seat in the gallery beside her mother, Max walking with the calm dignity of a dog who understood he'd done something important, the energy in the courtroom seemed to recalibrate. The judge exchanged a meaningful look with the court clerk, then cleared his throat. "We'll take a brief recess," the judge announced, 15 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, people moved slowly, as if still processing what they'd witnessed. The journalists clustered together, discussing what they'd seen, already mentally composing their articles. One approached Sarah Mitchell. "What we just witnessed," the journalist said, "was that orchestrated? Did you coach the dog to respond at that moment?" Sarah Mitchell met her gaze evenly. "Doctor trained Max. The signal was developed between Sarah and Max during their time together at home. I had no idea when Sarah would use it or even if she would. But when she did, Max responded exactly as he was trained to respond. That response was genuine, spontaneous, and, I would argue, far more eloquent than any words either of us could speak." Inside the consultation room, Sarah sat quietly with Max, her small frame pressed against the dog's side. Maria knelt beside her daughter, stroking her hair. "You were so brave," Maria whispered. "Did you hear what happened out there? Did you see how people reacted?" Sarah shook her head. Max was there and I could tell the truth." When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Even Robert seemed to sense it. His expression had changed from one of vindicated satisfaction to something more uncertain, more worried. He kept whispering urgently to his attorneys, who responded with tense, clipped answers. Closing arguments proceeded, but everything felt different. Sarah Mitchell's closing was powerful, but she wisely didn't rely solely on rhetoric. She referenced what had just occurred in the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, standing before the judge with quiet conviction, "you witnessed something today that transcended the typical boundaries of courtroom testimony. You witnessed a child who was so traumatized, so frightened, so emotionally damaged by her experiences with her father that she could not initially articulate those experiences through words alone. But when given the support she needed, when given the presence of a being who believed in her unconditionally, she found the courage to tell the truth." She paused, letting her words settle. The signal that Sarah gave to Max and Max's immediate response was not choreography. It was not manipulation. It was the authentic interaction between a child and an animal, developed through weeks of bonding and trust. That interaction communicated something that words cannot, that this child is genuinely traumatized, genuinely frightened, and genuinely in need of protection. Richard Dalton's closing argument was aggressive, but it lacked the confidence it had possessed before the recess. He tried to paint Sarah as confused, coached, manipulated. He tried to suggest that the emotional support dog had clouded the judge's judgment. He attempted to reframe the entire proceeding as a custody battle between two parents rather than a case involving a child's welfare. But his words seemed hollow now, disconnected from the reality everyone had witnessed. When both attorneys finished, the judge sat in silence for a long moment. The courtroom held its breath. "I will take a brief recess to consider my decision," the judge finally said. "We will reconvene in 1 hour with my ruling." That hour was agonizing. Maria, Sarah, and Max sat in the consultation room, and time seemed to move in distorted ways, sometimes racing, sometimes crawling. Sarah dozed off with her head on Max's side. Maria stared at the walls, her mind cycling through every possible outcome. When they returned to the courtroom, the judge took the bench with a particularly solemn expression. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Sarah, then at Maria, then at the attorneys. "This case," the judge began, "has presented me with testimony that is compelling not because of its eloquence or logical construction, but because of its authenticity. I have observed a child whose emotional responses were consistent with someone who has experienced significant trauma and emotional abuse. I have observed the effectiveness of a trained emotional support animal in facilitating that child's access to her own testimony. And I have made a decision based on what I believe to be in the best interests of the child." He paused, and in that pause, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "The court finds," he continued, his voice measured and deliberate, "that there has been a significant change in circumstances that warrants modification of the existing custody arrangement. However, before I issue my final ruling, I am ordering a comprehensive psychological evaluation to be conducted by a court-appointed child psychologist. I want an independent assessment of Sarah's emotional state, her recollections of events, and her overall welfare. That evaluation will be completed within 3 weeks, and we will reconvene for final arguments and judgment at that time." It wasn't the immediate victory Maria had hoped for, but it wasn't a loss either. It was a pause, a moment where truth would be given space to fully emerge, where an independent professional would examine the evidence without the pressure of the courtroom. As they filed out, the judge caught Sarah's eye one final time. And in that look, there was something that transcended the legal proceedings, an acknowledgement of her bravery, a recognition of her truth, and a promise that justice was being pursued. The 3 weeks following the courtroom hearing felt like an eternity to Maria. Sarah underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation conducted by Dr., a court-appointed child psychologist with over 20 years of experience in trauma assessment and child welfare cases. Dr. conducted multiple sessions with Sarah, both with and without Max present, using trauma-informed interview techniques and age-appropriate psychological assessments. During those 3 weeks, Maria found herself obsessively checking her phone, expecting updates that never came. She threw herself into work, grading papers with mechanical precision while her mind remained elsewhere. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to settle into a new equilibrium. With Max constantly by her side and with the knowledge that her truth was finally being heard, the child's anxiety levels decreased noticeably. She smiled more. She talked more. She seemed to be slowly reclaiming pieces of herself that fear had stolen. Judge Harrison Pierce sat in his private chambers on the evening of March 29th, reviewing the psychological evaluation that had been submitted by Dr. His desk was lit by a single brass lamp, casting warm light across the typed pages. He had requested no interruptions, not from his clerk, not from anyone. What he was about to read would inform one of the most significant decisions of his judicial career. Judge Pierce was a man of 68 years, a veteran of the Colorado court system with a reputation for being fair but unsentimentally practical. He believed in evidence, in following the law, in not allowing emotion to cloud judicial reasoning. But he was also a grandfather, and he had witnessed something in his courtroom 3 weeks ago that had unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He began reading Doctor's report carefully, methodically, absorbing every word. The evaluation was comprehensive and thorough. Doctor had conducted trauma assessments using standardized psychological instruments designed to detect signs of childhood trauma and emotional abuse. The results were striking. Sarah's responses indicated significant anxiety disorders consistent with prolonged emotional stress. She demonstrated symptoms of complex trauma, including hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, and what Doctor had identified as emotional abuse, sequelae, the long-term psychological effects of being consistently criticized, belittled, and made to feel responsible for an adult's emotional state. But what was perhaps most compelling were doctors' detailed notes from her interviews with Sarah. The psychologist had documented specific incidents that Sarah had described, incidents that were consistent with emotional abuse patterns, incidents that demonstrated a child's clear memory and genuine distress rather than coached testimony. Doctor had also noted something particularly significant. Sarah's descriptions remained consistent across multiple interviews, even when Doctor deliberately asked questions in different ways, trying to catch inconsistencies. The consistency and specificity of Sarah's recollections, Doctor had written, suggest genuine memory of events rather than coached or suggested narratives. Furthermore, Sarah's emotional responses during recollection, including her physiological anxiety responses, are consistent with genuine trauma recall rather than fabrication. Doctor had also addressed the presence of the emotional support dog in courtroom proceedings. She had written extensively about the therapeutic value of such animals, citing research demonstrating that children with anxiety disorders were able to access their memories and communicate more effectively in the presence of trained emotional support animals. But crucially, she had also noted, the presence of the animal did not alter the factual content of Sarah's testimony. Rather, it provided the psychological scaffolding necessary for her to access and communicate her genuine experiences. The truth Sarah told with Max present was the same truth she was attempting to tell without him. She simply had greater access to that truth when her nervous system was adequately regulated. Judge Pierce set down the report and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. He stood and walked to the window of his chambers, looking out at the Denver skyline illuminated against the darkening evening sky. He thought about what he had witnessed in his courtroom. He thought about the moment when Sarah made the signal to Max and the dog's instantaneous, perfect response. He thought about how that moment had shifted something in the entire proceeding, not because it was manipulative, but because it was so utterly, unmistakably genuine. Judge Pierce had presided over countless custody cases. He had heard lawyers make eloquent arguments. He had listened to expert witnesses provide complex testimony. He had reviewed mountains of documentation. But in all his years on the bench, he had rarely witnessed something as profoundly communicative as what he had seen between that child and that dog. He returned to his desk and picked up the report again, reviewing Doctor's final assessment and recommendations. Based on the comprehensive evaluation conducted, Doctor had concluded, I find that Sarah has experienced significant emotional abuse at the hands of her father, Robert Martinez. This abuse includes but is not limited to chronic criticism and belittlement, manipulation of the child's emotional state to make her responsible for her father's moods, isolation from her mother, and the use of conditional love as a control mechanism. These are recognized forms of emotional abuse, with documented long-term psychological consequences for children. Doctor's recommendation was clear. The custody arrangement should be modified to protect Sarah's psychological and allow her to heal from the documented trauma. Judge Pierce made a decision. He would issue his ruling at the reconvened hearing, and it would be based not on emotion, but on evidence, the accumulated, documented, irrefutable evidence of a child's genuine trauma and a father's pattern of emotional abuse. The following morning, Judge Pierce sat in his chambers and composed his written decision. It was methodical, thorough, and devastating in its clarity. He referenced the testimony given during the hearing. He referenced Doctor's comprehensive psychological evaluation. He referenced the research on emotional support animals and trauma-informed practices. And he made a statement that would later be quoted in legal journals and cited in other custody cases. The court finds, Judge Pierce wrote, that the evidence presented, including expert psychological evaluation and direct witness testimony, establishes by a preponderance of the evidence that the respondent, Robert Martinez, has engaged in emotional abuse of the minor child. Sarah Martinez. This abuse has resulted in documented psychological trauma, including anxiety disorders and complex trauma symptoms. The welfare of the minor child is best served by a modification of the existing custody arrangement to protect her from further harm while allowing for her psychological healing and recovery. He continued, addressing something that had clearly troubled him deeply. This court has observed testimony and evidence that might have been dismissed as unreliable or insufficient in traditional courtroom proceedings. However, this court has also observed how the presence of a trained emotional support animal facilitated access to genuine testimony from a traumatized child. This court recognizes that trauma affects children's ability to communicate their experiences in ways that may appear to lack credibility in adversarial legal proceedings. However, the presence of supporting psychological evidence confirms the validity of the child's testimony and the genuine nature of her distress. He paused in his writing, considering his next words carefully. This was the part that would be most significant, the part that might eventually change how courts across Colorado approach cases involving traumatized child witnesses. This court makes a formal recommendation, Judge Pierce wrote, that the Colorado court system consider developing protocols for the use of certified emotional support animals in proceedings involving child witnesses who have experienced trauma. The evidence presented in this case suggests that such animals do not compromise the integrity of testimony. Rather, they facilitate access to authentic testimony that might otherwise remain inaccessible due to the child's psychological trauma responses. Furthermore, this court recommends that additional training and guidelines be developed for legal professionals in trauma-informed practices, particularly in custody proceedings involving allegations of child abuse or neglect. When Judge Pierce finally set down his pen, he had composed not just a ruling in one case, but the seeds of what would become a significant shift in how the Colorado judicial system approached child welfare and testimony from traumatized witnesses. 3 days later, when court reconvened and Judge Pierce read his decision from the bench, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, as his words made clear the court's findings, that emotional abuse had been substantiated, that the custody arrangement would be modified, that Sarah's welfare was the paramount concern. The quiet but profound impact of that moment rippled through the legal community. Judge Pierce looked directly at Sarah as he concluded his remarks. This court commends the bravery of this child in speaking her truth, despite significant fear and trauma. This court also recognizes that the presence of emotional support has been instrumental in facilitating justice in this case. The court's door remains open to Sarah, and her safety and healing remain the priority of this court. As the gavel came down, Judge Pierce's realization had fully crystallized. Sometimes justice requires not just evidence and law, but compassion and a willingness to recognize that trauma operates in ways that transcend traditional courtroom paradigms. And sometimes, a golden retriever and a little girl can teach even a seasoned judge something fundamental about truth, courage, and the nature of authentic witness-bearing. The modified custody arrangement became effective immediately. Sarah would remain in the full custody of her mother, with her father granted only supervised visitation 2 hours per week at a designated family counseling center, with a professional supervisor present at all times. Additionally, Robert was mandated to complete a year-long therapeutic program addressing emotional abuse patterns, anger management, and his relationship with his daughter. The court made it explicitly clear that any further violations or lapses in appropriate behavior would result in the termination of visitation rights entirely. Robert's attorneys filed an appeal, which was ultimately dismissed. More significantly, Robert eventually decided to accept the judgment rather than continue fighting. 3 months after the ruling, he entered into a plea agreement acknowledging his patterns of emotional abuse and committing himself to the therapeutic process. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was a recognition of wrongdoing, a small but significant step toward accountability. For Sarah, the days and weeks following the ruling represented a new chapter. The weight that had pressed down on her small shoulders for so long began, gradually, to lift. Max remained her constant companion, but now the dog wasn't just a tool for survival. He was a symbol of victory, a living reminder that her truth had mattered, that her voice had been heard, that she was worthy of protection. Sarah began therapy with Dr. who specialized in trauma recovery for children. These sessions were different from the evaluation interviews. They were focused on healing rather than assessment. Dr. employed trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, using evidence-based techniques to help Sarah process her experiences and rebuild her sense of safety and self-worth. Max attended many of these sessions, lying quietly in the corner of Doctor's office, his mere presence providing an anchor for Sarah as she navigated the difficult work of trauma recovery. In the weeks following the judgment, Maria noticed changes in her daughter that seemed almost miraculous in their magnitude. Sarah began sleeping through the night without nightmares. Her appetite returned. She ate dinner with genuine enthusiasm rather than mechanical obligation. She started spending time with her friends again, her laughter once more becoming a regular feature of the household rather than an almost forgotten sound. One afternoon in May, nearly 2 months after the judgment, Sarah was sitting in the backyard with Max, throwing a tennis ball for the dog to retrieve. Maria watched from the porch, amazed at how much her daughter had transformed. The anxiety that had etched itself into Sarah's features was gradually being replaced by something softer, something more like the carefree childhood that should have been hers all along. "Mom," Sarah called out, "watch Max jump." Sarah threw the ball high into the air, and Max launched himself after it with joyful enthusiasm, his golden fur gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Sarah's laugh, genuine, unguarded, pure, echoed across the yard. Maria felt tears of gratitude and relief stream down her face. But Sarah's healing journey was just one part of the story that emerged from this case. The broader impact on the Colorado legal system was equally significant and far-reaching. Judge Harrison Pierce, energized by what he had witnessed and learned, began working with other judges and legal professionals to develop new protocols for handling child witnesses in trauma cases. He collaborated with child psychologists, trauma specialists, and legal experts to create guidelines for the use of certified emotional support animals in courtroom proceedings. These guidelines established clear criteria, training requirements, and protocols to ensure that such animals enhanced rather than compromised the integrity of testimony. The Colorado Bar Association took notice. By the end of the year, the state had formally recognized emotional support animals as a legitimate accommodation for traumatized child witnesses in family law proceedings. Other states began looking at Colorado's model, considering implementing similar protocols. Legal journals published articles about the case, analyzing the intersection of trauma-informed practices and judicial procedure. More significantly, the case sparked a broader conversation about how the legal system treats child witnesses in abuse cases. Bar associations began mandating training in trauma-informed practices for attorneys. Family court judges across Colorado attended workshops on recognizing signs of child trauma and understanding how trauma affects communication and memory. The case of Sarah and Max became a teaching tool, used in law schools to illustrate the importance of adapting courtroom procedures to accommodate the real psychological realities of traumatized children. Sarah Mitchell, Maria's attorney, became something of a leading voice in this movement. She gave presentations at legal conferences about trauma-informed advocacy for children. She wrote articles for legal journals. She consulted with other attorneys navigating similar cases. The case had launched her career in a new direction, toward a specialization in child welfare law with a trauma-informed approach. Dr. James, who had trained Max and developed the secret signal protocol with Sarah, was contacted by legal professionals across the country asking about his work. He began consulting with other trainers about developing similar programs specifically for courtroom support. By the end of the year, there were 5 other dogs in Colorado undergoing training specifically to serve as courtroom support animals for child witnesses. But perhaps most significantly, the case brought about changes in how society viewed both emotional support animals and childhood trauma. Media coverage of the case had been extensive, and the image of Sarah making the signal to Max, with Max's instantaneous response, had become iconic in the public imagination. It represented something powerful, the idea that sometimes truth is communicated through channels beyond words, and that sometimes the most profound witness-bearing happens in the space between a frightened child and a faithful dog. 1 year after the judgment, Sarah stood before a group of law students at the University of Colorado Law School. Judge Pierce had invited her to share her story as part of a seminar on trauma-informed legal practices. Sarah was 9 years old now, noticeably taller and healthier than she had been in the courtroom. She wore a simple blue dress, and Max walked beside her, his collar gleaming. As Sarah described her experiences, first in a child's words, then with help from the moderator translating her experiences into legal concepts, the law students listened with rapt attention. When Sarah described making the signal to Max and how it had helped her find her courage, several students had tears streaming down their faces. "I was really scared," Sarah explained, her voice steady and clear. "I didn't think anyone would believe me, but Max believed me. And then when other people saw Max believe me, they believed me too." She paused, looking down at Max, whose head rested against her leg. "Max helped me tell the truth, and the truth helped me get safe." After the presentation, students crowded around Sarah, asking questions, petting Max, thanking her for her bravery. One young woman, a law student who had grown up in an abusive household herself, approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "You gave me hope," the law student said. "Seeing you speak up, seeing the system actually listen, it made me believe that maybe healing is possible." Sarah hugged her, Max's tail wagging gently at the outpouring of emotion. By Sarah's 10th birthday, 3 years after that fateful courtroom moment, she had become an advocate in her own right. She participated in awareness campaigns about childhood emotional abuse. She appeared at legal conferences alongside judges and attorneys, sharing her perspective as a child who had navigated the legal system. She worked with Max to visit schools, teaching other children about recognizing abuse and finding help. Her father, Robert, continued his therapeutic work. After 2 years of mandated counseling, he began supervised visits with Sarah, brief meetings in a therapeutic setting where he could demonstrate genuine change and accountability. These visits were difficult, but they represented the possibility of eventual healing and reconciliation, though on Sarah's terms and in her own time. Maria returned to teaching with renewed purpose. She became an advocate for trauma-informed education, training her colleagues on recognizing signs of abuse in students and responding with compassion. She established a scholarship fund in Sarah's name for children from abusive households seeking higher education. Max lived another 10 years, remaining Sarah's constant companion throughout her teenage years and into her early adulthood. When Max finally passed away at the age of 16, Sarah grieved deeply, not just for the loss of a beloved pet, but for the embodiment of unconditional support and belief that Max had represented. But Max's legacy endured. The protocols developed for courtroom support animals continued to evolve and improve. Hundreds of traumatized children in Colorado and beyond received the same kind of support that Sarah had received. The simple act of a little girl making a secret signal to her dog had rippled outward, creating systemic change that protected countless vulnerable children. Years later, when Sarah was asked to reflect on her experience, she would say something that captured the essence of what had happened. "I learned that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes the quietest moment, a child's hand in a dog's head, can change everything. My truth mattered. Max taught me that, and that changed my whole life. The signal that Sarah and Max had created together became more than a private language between a child and a dog. It became a symbol of hope, of the power of authentic connection, and of the transformative possibility that emerges when a system designed to seek justice finally learns to truly listen, not just with its ears, but with its heart. The end.